Bismillah. This is Field Notes Occupation, a Noble Savage Reproduction. I'm Dr. Zara Khan, and in today's final episode, we are going to be looking at a summary analysis of, what my colleagues and I found when we took our fact-finding mission in 2003, and we conducted this fieldwork with ordinary Palestinians at every level of life and the social landscape, trying to understand what does it mean to live under military occupation. And today's episode is going to try to provide some political and socioeconomic analysis of the situation by looking at the vicious cycle of violence that is created through the Israeli military occupation in the West Bank. When I say vicious cycle of violence, we have a pattern in Palestine, in the occupied territories, of land confiscation, which leads to the building of settlements. So the Israeli government continues to confiscate land. In 1948, scores of Palestinians were driven from their homeland in order for the Israeli state to be carved. It was intended to be a land without people for a people without land, but the problem is that Palestinians were inhabiting the land, and they were forcibly removed from the land and expelled in many areas in order for the British mandate to bring the Israeli state into existence. From 1948 through the present day, through November of 2023, the Israeli state continues to confiscate land that belongs to Palestinians, and it builds more and more settlements. Now, creating settlements in occupied territories is illegal according to international law. However, Israel behaves as if it is above that law and continues to expand settlements, number of settlers, providing incentives often for people to migrate and settle in the occupied territories. What makes this a cycle of violence is that each of these unfortunate phenomenon lead into the next, and then it starts all over again. So from land confiscation to the building and expansion of settlements, now you have the need, quote unquote, for policing. Because if you have Jewish settlers living on illegal settlements, which is essentially stolen land, more stolen land from Palestinian territories, now you justify a police presence in order to bring the strength of force, of police force, ammunition, brute violent force, as a threat in order to protect the settlements from the indigenous population of the Palestinians. Those of us that are familiar with, in the United States, in the American context, when poor neighborhoods, poor working class, people of color neighborhoods are gentrified, real estate, big people in real estate with big resources may come and buy up areas of land within that neighborhood, which is dilapidated and falling apart and underfunded, and they will revamp it and offer luxury housing, for example, at cheaper rates than in other area codes and zip codes. And so this attracts wealthier young urban professionals, let's say, to come and settle in those areas. And one of the things you'll notice if you've ever been to a newly gentrified area is the excessive police presence. And the reason is the same. The people who have settled into a territory in this context and in this way, in order to feel safe, they have a barrier of police presence. And so oftentimes the policing that occurs in and around settlements is a direct consequence of those settlements, right? In order for those settlers to feel safe in this illegitimate settlement. Increased policing leads to increased imprisonment of Palestinian people. Again, to keep with the analogy on the American side, the same is true, right? The more police presence in a neighborhood which is being gentrified, the more people in that neighborhood will go through the criminal justice system, have arrest records, go through the system, etc. What you find with the restraints of land confiscation, settlement building and expansion, policing and imprisonment is that healthcare and education become less and less viable and sustainable as I spoke about in a previous episode when I looked at healthcare and education. Let's look a little more closely at land confiscation. And this is, we can think about this in terms of what David Harvey calls accumulation by dispossession, or just taking without permission. A Nakba, 1948, this is the war between, the war that established Israel in the first place, its founding war, and that political violence led to the creation of the first great multitude of refugees who were Palestinians. So the United Nations Relief Work and Assistance Agency for Palestine refugees was started in 1948, right after An-Nakba, right after the War of 1948. And their goal was to provide assistance to those defined as Palestine refugees. Who's a Palestine refugee? Anyone who lived in Palestine between June 1946 and 1948. If you lived at that time and were displaced, you were eligible for services from UNRWA. Now, in 1950, the year that UNRWA first became operational in its services to Palestine refugees, it served 750,000 Palestine refugees. So nearly, three-quarter of a million Palestine refugees. As mentioned, settlement growth continues to the present day, and so over the last many number of decades, the number of Palestinian refugees has only continued to grow. 1967 Green Line was supposed to represent the borders between Israel and the Palestinian territories of West Bank and Gaza, but that, those agreements were not made in good faith, and we know that because subsequently the state of Israel has continued to confiscate more land, as we mentioned when we looked at Jayus in a previous episode. Home seizures continue, unfortunately, until this day. If we take a closer look at settlements, as mentioned, to build a settlement in an occupied territory is illegal according to international law. However, what we find is that the Israeli government continues to support and incentivize the Jewish people to settle in settlements. Now, in the West Bank, this is advertised internationally in the United States, for example, leaflets and programs to circulate advertising that the ancient lands of Judea and Sumeria are where present-day West Bank is. And so those Jewish people in diaspora worldwide who are motivated by religious observance to live proximate to and within the ancient lands of Judea and Sumeria, they are called upon to settle in the West Bank in these illegal settlements, and they do in larger and larger numbers. Now, what we have in the West Bank is you have two ethno-national geographies. You have Palestinian and Israeli, and what in a work called The Civilian Occupation, the Politics of Verticality, which is edited by Siegel and Weissman, we find that there is an optical planning that occurs, a verticality, and this provides the Israeli state with a tactical strength and a panoramic view. Palestinian villages are in the lowlands, and the settlements are built atop hilltops, very high up, and this gives the tactical advantage of being able to see from up there on the hilltops. When we were just outside Bethlehem, we also came to learn that one of the Israeli settlements would throw its garbage down the hill and it would end up landing in the Palestinian village below. We have non-traditional boundaries here because the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are on two opposite sides, and between them is the state of Israel. And so surveillance and control become very important, and these settlements lead to policing, right? As I mentioned just a few moments ago, the need for increased police presence to separate the Israeli settlers from the Palestinian villagers all around them. Hilltop outposts have also been created unabated for several decades. Starting in the 1970s, you had the emergence of a Jewish extremist group called the Gush Amanim, and this was a big part of their tactical strategy. Altogether, the observation network of Israeli settlements overlooking the West Bank represents 40%. On top of mountains, settlements can only see other settlements. The Palestinians basically recede from view, and it enforces the myth that this was a land without people for a people without land. Rather than having a traditional border between the two territories, the settlements lead to multiple separations, provisional boundaries, hence making surveillance and control all the more imperative for the Israeli project. Here, from Siegel and Weissman's book Civilian Occupation, we see a picture from the 1950s of the Israeli neighborhood of Zara Khan in Holon. Here we see the Palje Mayim outpost near Eli settlement, just outside Ramallah, and again you can see the verticality here. You can see this is a topographical image. The settlements are atop the hilltops, and the Palestinian towns are down below. The same is here. We have Nokdim in the bottom of the image and Tekoa at the top of the image, both outside Bethlehem, and you can see again the topographical, the vertical power that is being exuded through this urban planning of these settlements. Another settlement here, and beneath it, the Shuafat refugee camp just outside Jerusalem. This is a photograph from our own trip, not from the Civilian Occupation book. And this is the settlement outside Bethlehem, we were told, that often throws its trash down below into the valley with the Palestinian village below. Policing and imprisonment. We know that Palestinian men, young and old, in the West Bank and Gaza move through the prison system through being arrested and imprisoned. At some point through their life, they can count on being arrested, detained, and or imprisoned by Israeli Defense Forces. The larger context here that we should really keep in mind is the war on terror. The war on terror, which started after the September 11th attacks, spearheaded by the United States, supported by Great Britain, France, and many other nations throughout the world, became a blank check to police, to criminalize, to imprison, to interrogate, to torture dissident groups from Europe all the way to the Philippines, where the Philippine government used the war on terror to crack down on the peaceful Mindanao Muslim population. And so what did that mean in the West Bank and in the context of Israeli military occupation of the West Bank? Well, it added a layer of normative protection to the practices of the occupying forces, because during the war on terror, our trip was in 2003. This is at the height of the war on terror. Invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan were either forthcoming or already well underway, and no one can question during such circumstances and fear-mongering that the Israeli military takes very severe, harsh, and unnecessarily forceful measures against civilian populations under its control. We also have to keep in mind the military-industrial complex in the world, made up of multinational weapons corporations who make a lot of money when the United States sends billions of dollars in aid every year to Israel, most of which comes back through contracts to American security as well as infrastructure and communications companies. We can look at the cyclical nature of incarceration, and we can observe this in the American context. Groups of Americans, African American, Latino Americans who move through the prison systems, oftentimes their children who grow up in single-parent homes because dad is incarcerated will end up moving through the same system at some point in their life as well. And we observe this in the West Bank of Palestine as well. You have resistance to the occupation, which leads to imprisonment, as well as to, in many cases, assassinations of political leaders, which leads to more resistance, a culture of violence, and as we saw with the interview with children, the wish for martyrdom in order to sacrifice one's own life just to end the occupation for everyone else. In this context, Israeli intelligence is worth noting. It is highly sophisticated, intimate, and exact knowledge, not only blueprints of buildings, but of associational life and family trees and businesses and supply chains of every sort. And Israeli intelligence is very complex and sophisticated in that regard, and that helps in the project of surveillance and control of the Palestinian population. We have criminalization and imprisonment. Anyone who resists the occupation in any way is criminalized and arrested and imprisoned. We have the use of excessive force, and I talked about this in the previous episode on collective punishment and torture, corporal punishment, and really a modern-day caste system. Even within the State of Israel, not all Jewish people are of equal social status. You have the Mizrahim and the Sephardic Jews are not at the same level. They face discrimination in the military. There were women of non-Ashkenazi descent in the Israeli Defense Forces who were forcibly sterilized. This came out in the news before. And so even within the State of Israel, you have this racial hierarchy. So imagine, given all of this free license and impunity with which the Israeli military power imposes occupation upon Palestinians who are Arab instead of Israeli, who are Muslim instead of Jewish, and who are occupied instead of possessing a sovereign national state of their own. All of this leads to a caste system. Continuing on here to our conclusion, the adverse results of occupation include humiliation. Daily, there is the dignity of Palestinian people is violated every single day as long as they live under military occupation. The economy is completely impoverished because, as mentioned in previous episodes, mobility is highly restricted. Palestinians need permission from Israeli Defense Forces to do just about anything involving their livelihood, whether it's planting a tree or running a business or moving goods or services from one location to the other. You have a tattered social fabric. Women's rights, their economic independence, schools, education, society, something as simple as having a parade in your city. All of these things we've seen in just this one report back, which was just a small sampling of time in the West Bank of life under occupation. We see that all of these are in pieces and completely tattered. Social fabric is under the knife as long as the military occupation of the West Bank continues. Political disenfranchisement. Palestinian men and women do not have the means to participate in a political process that can redress their social ills and change their actual material conditions. That is disenfranchisement, and that is upheld by the occupation, made possible by the occupation. And as shown throughout this course, through the various episodes, there is a long list of human rights violations that we ourselves documented during this short trip, showing that the Israeli military daily violates the human rights of Palestinian people.